A billionaire CEO walks into a small-town diner and says the unthinkable. "I need a wife, and you need strong sons." She's a poor waitress, barely holding her sick child's hand, and suddenly this stranger offers her a deal that could change everything. But behind his suit and charm hides a man broken by loss, and behind her soft smile, a secret that could destroy him. When money and mercy collide, their worlds crash together in ways neither expected. He thinks it's a business arrangement, but love doesn't follow contracts. As the truth about their pasts begins to surface, hearts will be tested, faith will be shaken, and one impossible choice will decide their future. Can two broken souls build a real family? Or will the lies that brought them together tear them apart forever? Tell me in the comments where you're watching from right now, and if this story speaks to you, make sure you hit subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Thunder crackled across the night sky as Matthew Duvall's sleek black Mercedes wound its way down the empty highway. The windshield wipers fought against the heavy November rain, their rhythmic swooshing matching the hollow feeling in his chest. He'd just left the funeral of George Miller, his company's head janitor of 30 years, a man who'd shown more loyalty than most executives he knew. The golden glow of a roadside diner pierced through the darkness ahead, its neon "open" sign flickering against the stormy backdrop. Matthew hadn't planned to stop, but something about that warm light drew him in, like a ship to harbor in rough seas. He eased his car into the nearly empty parking lot, the tires crunching over wet gravel. As he stepped out, the cold rain immediately soaked through his expensive suit. He made a dash for the entrance, the bell above the door announcing his arrival with a cheerful jingle that felt out of place with his mood. The diner was almost empty, save for a truck driver hunched over a plate of eggs at the counter. The air smelled of coffee and warm pie, and fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting a harsh glow on the worn linoleum floor. Matthew's leather shoes squeaked as he made his way to a booth, water dripping from his coat. "Be right with you," called a gentle voice from somewhere in the back. Matthew's eyes wandered around the dated interior until they landed on something unexpected. A small boy, no more than 7 or 8 years old, fast asleep in the last booth. He was curled up under a patchwork blanket, his face peaceful despite the thunder outside. A young woman appeared from the kitchen, wiping her hands on her apron as she approached his table. Her name tag read Evelyn, and despite the late hour and obvious exhaustion in her eyes, she offered him a genuine smile that reached all the way to her kind brown eyes. "Awful weather tonight," she said, pulling out her order pad. "Can I get you something to warm you up?" "Just coffee, Black," Matthew replied, his voice rougher than he intended. "Coming right up." She turned toward the coffee maker, then paused to glance at the sleeping boy. Something in her expression softened even further, and Matthew found himself watching as she quietly adjusted the blanket around the child's shoulders. As Evelyn worked, Matthew noticed how she moved with careful efficiency, like someone used to making every step count. She poured his coffee with steady hands, then proceeded to attend to the truck driver with the same gentle attention she'd shown him. Between serving customers, she wiped down tables with methodical care, occasionally stealing glances at the sleeping boy. During one such moment, Matthew overheard her whispered prayer. "Please, Lord," she murmured, her head bowed slightly as she worked. "Help my Benji get better. Give me strength to keep going. That's all I ask." Something shifted in Matthew's chest at those words, a feeling he couldn't quite name. It had been years since he'd heard anyone pray with such simple, honest faith. The last time had been... He pushed the memory away before it could fully form. Time passed slowly in the warm diner as the storm raged outside. Matthew found himself ordering a second cup of coffee, then a third, watching Evelyn's quiet grace as she worked. She handled a demanding customer with patience, offered a kind word to the tired truck driver, and somehow managed to keep an eye on her sleeping son through it all. When Matthew finally decided to leave, he walked out to his car only to find it wouldn't start. The engine made a sickly sound and died completely. He stood there in the rain for a moment, water streaming down his face, before trudging back inside. Evelyn looked up from where she was refilling sugar dispensers. "Car trouble." Matthew nodded, trying to hide his frustration. "It won't start." "The storm might pass soon," she offered, then hesitated before adding, "Would you like to try a slice of pie while you wait? I just pulled an apple one from the oven." He started to decline, but something in her expression stopped him. Not pity, but genuine kindness. "That would be nice. Thank you." As she served him a warm slice of pie, the aroma of cinnamon and apples filled the air. The thunder continued to roll outside, but in here, in this simple diner with its flickering lights and worn booths, Matthew felt an unexpected sense of peace. From the back booth, the little boy stirred slightly in his sleep, and Evelyn immediately went to check on him. She brushed his hair back from his forehead with such tenderness that Matthew had to look away, his throat tight with memories of another woman, another child, from what felt like a lifetime ago. "Is he okay?" Matthew found himself asking when she returned to refill his coffee. Evelyn's smile dimmed slightly. "He's hanging in there. Benji's a fighter." She paused, then added softly, "He has to be." The rain continued to drum against the windows as Matthew ate his pie, each bite reminding him of Sunday dinners from his childhood. He watched as Evelyn continued her work, moving through the diner like a guardian angel in a worn uniform, spreading warmth and kindness in her wake. The trucker eventually paid his bill and left, leaving Matthew alone with Evelyn and her sleeping son. The silence was comfortable, broken only by the storm outside and the gentle clink of dishes as Evelyn worked. In this moment, far from his corporate office and the pressures of his world, Matthew felt something he hadn't experienced in years, a sense of being exactly where he needed to be. The storm had finally passed, leaving behind puddles that reflected the pale morning light streaming through the diner's windows. The air smelled fresh and clean, like the world had been washed new. Inside Jerry's all-night diner, the fluorescent lights seemed harsh compared to the gentle dawn creeping in. Evelyn moved between tables with the coffee pot, her steps careful but efficient. Her wrist ached beneath the beige medical brace, a constant reminder of her fall last week. Still, she managed a warm smile for each customer as she made her rounds. "More coffee?" she asked an elderly man in a plaid shirt who had been nursing the same cup for the past hour. "Thank you, dear," he replied, lifting his cup with trembling hands. Matthew Duval sat at the counter, watching her work. He'd stayed through the night after his car trouble, catching fragments of sleep in one of the vinyl booths. Now, cleaned up as best he could manage in the diner's small bathroom, he noticed details about Evelyn he'd missed in the darkness. The slight limp in her walk, the way she favored her right wrist, the tired shadows under her eyes. In the morning light, Benji had woken up and now sat at the counter beside Matthew, happily munching on toast with jelly. The boy's presence seemed to brighten the whole diner despite his obvious pallor. "Mom makes the best toast," Benji informed Matthew seriously, red jelly staining the corners of his mouth. "She knows exactly how long to cook it." "Is that so?" Matthew found himself smiling at the child's earnest expression. "Yep, and she cuts the crusts off just right," Benji demonstrated with his half-eaten piece. "Not too much, not too little." Evelyn approached with fresh coffee, her cheeks slightly pink. "Benji, honey, I'm sure Mr. Duval isn't interested in my toast-making skills." "Actually," Matthew said, surprising himself. I find it fascinating. There's an art to doing simple things well. A crash from the kitchen interrupted their conversation. Evelyn hurried toward the sound, but Matthew was faster. He found her struggling with a heavy box of canned goods that had slipped from the shelf. Let me help, he said, stepping forward. Oh, I couldn't. Evelyn started to protest, but winced as she tried to lift the box with her injured wrist. Please, Matthew insisted, already bending to gather the scattered cans. I noticed your brace earlier. What happened? Evelyn sighed, watching as he easily lifted the box onto the shelf. I slipped on some ice last week. It's nothing serious, just a sprain, but... She gestured at the general chaos of the kitchen. It makes everything take twice as long. Matthew found himself reaching for another box. Where does this one go? For the next 15 minutes, they worked together in comfortable silence, Matthew lifting the heavier items while Evelyn directed him. As they finished, she leaned against the counter, absently rubbing her wrist. Thank you, she said softly. You didn't have to do that. It was no trouble. Matthew hesitated, then added, I noticed you seemed worried earlier when you were checking your phone. Evelyn's face tightened, almost imperceptibly. She glanced toward the counter where Benji sat, making sure he was out of earshot. Is everything all right? Matthew pressed gently. She was quiet for a long moment, then spoke in a low voice. No, not really. I'm behind on rent again, and Benji's medical bills... She shook her head. I'm sorry, I shouldn't burden you with this. You've already been so kind. Please, Matthew said. Sometimes it helps to talk. Evelyn's shoulders slumped slightly. It's just... everything keeps piling up. The insurance only covers part of Benji's treatments, and even with 2 jobs, I can barely keep up with the minimum payments. And now the landlord's threatening eviction if I'm late again, and I... She stopped abruptly, pressing her lips together. I'm sorry. You don't need to hear all this. Matthew watched her compose herself, straightening her apron with determined hands. He reached into his wallet and pulled out a business card, along with several large bills. This is for the coffee and pie, he said, placing the money on the counter. And this, he held out the card, is in case you ever need help. Any kind of help. Evelyn stared at the card, her eyes widening as she read his full title. You're Matthew Duval, of Duval Industries. He nodded, suddenly uncomfortable with her surprise. Please, take it. My direct number is on the back. She shook her head slightly. I couldn't possibly... Just take it, he said gently. You don't have to use it, but if you need anything... He let the sentence hang unfinished between them. With trembling fingers, Evelyn took the card and slipped it into her apron pocket. She tried to return the extra money, but Matthew was already walking away, back to where Benji sat swinging his legs at the counter. It was nice meeting you, Benji, he said, ruffling the boy's hair. Take care of your mother for me. Bye, Mr. Duval, Benji called after him, waving enthusiastically. The bell above the door chimed as Matthew left, and Evelyn stood frozen, feeling the weight of his business card in her pocket like a stone. Later that evening, after her second shift at the convenience store, Evelyn sat at her small kitchen table in their apartment. The single overhead light cast harsh shadows on the bills spread before her. Benji was asleep in the next room, his breathing slightly labored, even with his medication. Her phone lay silent on the table, but she could still hear the hospital administrator's voice from earlier. I'm sorry, Mrs. Turner, but we'll have to pause Benji's treatment until the outstanding balance is addressed. She pulled Matthew's card from her pocket, running her thumb over the embossed letters. The paper was thick and expensive, so different from the past due notices scattered across her table. His direct number was written on the back in precise handwriting. Call me if you ever need help, he'd said. But did he really mean it? People said things like that all the time, empty offers of assistance that evaporated when actually needed. The heating unit in the corner sputtered and died again, and Evelyn pulled her cardigan tighter around her shoulders. From Benji's room came the sound of coughing, followed by the wheezing that always made her heart clench with worry. She picked up her phone, then set it down again. Pride warred with desperation as she stared at the business card, torn between the shame of asking for help and the terror of failing her son. Outside, a car alarm wailed in the distance, and somewhere down the hall, a baby started crying. Evelyn sat in her dim kitchen, Matthew's card in one hand and her phone in the other, while the weight of decision pressed down on her shoulders like a physical thing. The morning sun streamed through the diner's windows, catching dust motes in golden beams. Evelyn mechanically wiped down tables, her movements slower than usual after another sleepless night. The weight of Matthew's business card still pressed against her hip in her apron pocket, unused. The bell above the door chimed, and Evelyn's heart skipped when she saw Matthew Duval stride in. Gone was yesterday's rain-soaked traveller. Today he wore an impeccably tailored charcoal suit, his presence commanding attention even in the humble diner. A few regular customers looked up from their eggs and coffee, sensing something different about this visitor. "Good morning," he said, his voice low and controlled. Evelyn clutched her cleaning rag tighter. "Good morning, Mr. Duval. Coffee?" "Actually." He glanced around the nearly empty diner. "I was hoping we could talk privately for a moment." She hesitated, then nodded toward an isolated booth in the corner. "Let me tell Betty I'm taking my break." Once seated across from him, Evelyn noticed the shadows under his eyes, partially hidden behind his composed expression. He folded his hands on the table, wedding ring notably absent. "I'll be direct," he said quietly. "I need a wife. You need help with your son's medical care. I believe we can help each other." Evelyn stared at him, certain she'd misheard. "I'm sorry, what?" "The board of my father's company is threatening to remove me unless I demonstrate a more—" He paused, choosing his words carefully. "Stable family image. They believe a CEO should project traditional values, especially given recent negative press." "Mr. Duval," Evelyn said slowly, "if this is some kind of joke, it's not." His eyes met hers steadily. "I'm proposing a mutually beneficial arrangement. 6 months of marriage. In return, I'll cover all of Benji's medical expenses, past, present, and future." The air seemed to thin around her. "You can't be serious." "I'm always serious about business proposals, Mrs. Turner." Her phone buzzed in her pocket. With shaking hands, she pulled it out, recognizing the medical supply company's number. "Excuse me, I have to take this." She turned slightly away from Matthew, but couldn't hide her face falling as she listened. "Yes, I understand. No, please, we need that machine. I can make a partial payment." Her voice cracked. "Please, just give me 1 more week." She ended the call, her hands trembling so badly she nearly dropped the phone. The oxygen machine Benji used at night would be repossessed by the end of the week. Without it, his condition would deteriorate rapidly. "Problems?" Matthew asked quietly. Evelyn pressed her fingers to her temples, fighting back tears. "They're taking Benji's oxygen machine," she whispered. "I don't know what to do anymore." "I can help," Matthew said. "All of it. The medical bills, the equipment, the treatments. Benji would have access to the best specialists in the country. In exchange for marrying you?" The words felt surreal leaving her mouth. "A temporary arrangement," he clarified. 6 months. We'll live at my estate, present a united front to the board and public. After that, we'll divorce amicably. You and Benji will be provided for generously in the settlement." Evelyn's mind spun. "But why me? You could hire an actress, find someone more—" She gestured vaguely at his expensive suit. Suitable. Because you're genuine, he said simply. The board would see through an actress, but you... His eyes softened slightly. You have authentic kindness. That's what my company's image needs right now. The diner's sounds faded to a distant hum as Evelyn considered his words. Marriage, to a virtual stranger. The idea should have been preposterous, offensive even. But Benji's wheezing breaths echoed in her memory, along with the hospital administrator's warning about suspended treatments. I would need to know Benji's care is guaranteed, she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. In writing. Matthew pulled a folder from his briefcase. My lawyers drew up preliminary papers this morning. Everything is spelled out. Medical care, living arrangements, financial terms. Take time to review it. Evelyn's hand shook as she accepted the folder. This is crazy, she murmured. It's business, Matthew corrected gently, with the potential to help us both. She stared at the papers, her vision blurring slightly. If I agreed, when would this happen? As soon as possible. The board meets next week. The diner's door chimed again, and Evelyn saw Benji bounce in, dropped off by their elderly neighbor who watched him during her morning shift. His face lit up when he spotted Matthew. Mr. Duval, he called out, hurrying over despite his slightly labored breathing. You came back. Matthew's stern expression softened. Hello, Benji. Are you having breakfast? Mom makes the best pancakes. They're like clouds, but tastier. Benji, Evelyn said quietly. Mr. Duval and I are talking about something important. Can you please sit at the counter and do your reading? Okay, Mom. He grinned at Matthew before skipping away, his ever-present inhaler bouncing in his pocket. Evelyn watched him go, her heart clenching. She turned back to Matthew, who was observing her closely. 6 months? She asked. He nodded. And Benji's care is guaranteed no matter what? You have my word, Matthew said solemnly. Every treatment, every specialist, every piece of equipment he needs. Evelyn took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the moment press down on her. Her son's life, or her pride. When she looked at it that way, there was no choice at all. Yes, she whispered, then cleared her throat and said more firmly, yes, I'll do it, for Benji. Matthew's expression didn't change, but something in his eyes shifted. He pulled out a pen and placed it beside the contract. Sign here, and I'll have my team begin arrangements immediately. Evelyn's hand trembled as she picked up the pen. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, and somewhere in the kitchen, a plate clattered. She thought of Benji's oxygen machine, of past due medical bills, of treatments denied and specialists they couldn't afford to see. She signed. Matthew took the contract carefully, tucking it back into his briefcase. My assistant will contact you this afternoon to begin arrangements. Pack what's essential. We'll get anything else you need. Evelyn nodded numbly, still processing what she'd just agreed to. Mrs. Turner, he said softly, causing her to look up. I know this isn't conventional, but I believe we can make this work. For both our sakes. She managed a weak smile, watching as he stood and straightened his suit jacket. Before he left, he placed a black credit card on the table. For immediate expenses, he said. Use it for whatever you and Benji need. The bell chimed as he departed, leaving Evelyn alone in the booth, staring at the sleek card that represented her son's salvation and the price she'd agreed to pay for it. Mom? Benji called from the counter. Can I have chocolate chip pancakes? Of course, sweetie. She called back, quickly wiping her eyes and standing. She tucked the credit card into her apron pocket alongside Matthew's business card, feeling the weight of both against her hip as she walked toward the kitchen. She had chosen this path for her son. Now she had to find the strength to walk it. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the courthouse steps as Evelyn Turner smoothed her best dress, a navy blue number from the thrift store that she'd carefully ironed that morning. Her fingers traced the worn hem nervously as she waited, clutching Benji's small hand in hers. Matthew's sleek black car pulled up precisely at 2 o'clock. He emerged looking every bit the successful CEO in his charcoal grey suit that probably cost more than her yearly rent. Benji bounced on his toes, waving enthusiastically. "Mr. Duval, Mom made me wear my church shoes." He proudly displayed his polished second-hand dress shoes. Matthew's stern expression softened slightly. "Very appropriate, Benji. Shall we?" He gestured toward the courthouse doors. Inside, their footsteps echoed on the marble floors as they made their way to the clerk's office. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, making Evelyn even more aware of the contrast between her worn clothing and Matthew's pristine appearance. The clerk, a middle-aged woman with reading glasses perched on her nose, looked up as they approached. Her eyes darted between Matthew in his $1,000 suit and Evelyn in her modest dress and scuffed thrift store shoes. The woman's eyebrows rose slightly, and Evelyn felt her cheeks burn. "Marriage license application?" the clerk asked, her tone carefully neutral. "Yes," Matthew replied smoothly, producing the necessary paperwork from his briefcase. "Everything should be in order." Benji settled into a nearby chair with his backpack, pulling out a worn copy of his favorite adventure book. Evelyn watched him, drawing strength from his presence as the clerk processed their paperwork. "Sign here, please," the clerk directed, sliding forms across the counter. "And here, and here." Evelyn's hand trembled slightly as she signed. Each signature felt like both a betrayal of her principles and a lifeline for her son. Matthew's signatures, in contrast, were swift and confident. The clerk stamped the final document with a heavy thud that seemed to echo Evelyn's heartbeat. "Congratulations," she said, though her tone suggested curiosity rather than celebration. Matthew thanked her professionally, gathering the papers into his briefcase. Evelyn managed a quiet "thank you" as well, though her voice caught slightly in her throat. "Ready to see your new home?" Matthew asked as they exited the courthouse. Benji bounced excitedly. "Is it like a castle? Do you have a pool?" "Benji," Evelyn cautioned gently, but Matthew actually smiled slightly. "There is a pool," he confirmed, "though it's a bit cold for swimming now." The drive out of the city took them through increasingly affluent neighborhoods until they turned onto a private road lined with towering oak trees. Evelyn's breath caught as Matthew's estate came into view, a massive modern structure of glass and stone that seemed to rise organically from the manicured landscape. "Wow!" Benji pressed his face against the car window. "Mom, look! It's bigger than my whole school!" Evelyn's fingers twisted nervously in her lap as they pulled up to the front entrance. The house seemed to stretch endlessly in both directions, all clean lines and gleaming surfaces. Matthew's driver opened their doors, and Benji tumbled out excitedly. "This way," Matthew directed, leading them through massive double doors into a soaring entry hall. Marble floors stretched out before them, their footsteps echoing in the vast space. Floor-to-ceiling windows filled the area with natural light, illuminating spotless glass surfaces and elegant modern furniture. The silence felt heavy, almost oppressive, broken only by Benji's delighted gasps. "Can I look around?" he asked, practically vibrating with excitement. Evelyn hesitated, but Matthew nodded. "Of course, just be careful." Benji took off down one of the hallways, his footsteps echoing off the high ceilings. Evelyn instinctively moved to follow him, but Matthew touched her arm lightly. "He'll be fine," he assured her. "Let me introduce you to the staff." Several people had gathered discreetly in the main hall, a housekeeper, a cook, and what appeared to be personal assistants. Their curious gazes made Evelyn's cheeks warm again. "Everyone," Matthew announced formally. "I'd like you to meet my wife, Evelyn, and my stepson, Benji. They'll be living here from now on." The staff's carefully neutral expressions couldn't quite hide their surprise, but they all murmured polite greetings. The housekeeper, a woman named Mrs. Chen, stepped forward with a kind smile. "Welcome, Mrs. Duval. Would you like to see your rooms?" Evelyn startled slightly at the new name, but managed to nod. "Yes, thank you. And please, call me Evelyn." Mrs. Chen led them upstairs to a wing of the house, with sweeping views of the grounds. Benji's room was already furnished with a new bed and desk, while the master suite took Evelyn's breath away with its sheer size. "Your things arrived earlier," Mrs. Chen explained, indicating several boxes. "Would you like help unpacking?" "No, thank you," Evelyn said quickly. "I can manage." Once alone, she sat on the edge of the enormous bed, running her hand over the silk duvet. The room was bigger than their entire apartment. Benji's delighted laughter echoed from somewhere in the house, and she closed her eyes, whispering a prayer of gratitude. "Thank you, Lord, for this blessing. Please help us make this work, for Benji's sake." Later that evening, in his home office, Matthew's phone rang. His lawyer's number flashed on the screen. "Just checking in," the lawyer said after pleasantries were exchanged. "Everything went smoothly at the courthouse?" "Yes, all the paperwork is in order." "Good, good. And you're clear on the timeline? The contract ends in 6 months, as specified." "I'm aware," Matthew replied shortly. "Just making sure you remember this is temporary. We don't want any complications when it's time to—" "Thank you for checking in," Matthew interrupted. "Good night." He ended the call and stood at his office window, watching as Benji explored the garden below, Evelyn hovering nearby. The boy's enthusiasm was infectious, even drawing smiles from the usually reserved gardener. From somewhere in the house, a clock chimed the hour, its sound echoing through the marble halls that no longer seemed quite so empty. The first week in Matthew Duval's mansion felt like learning to navigate an intricate dance where Evelyn didn't know the steps. Everything ran like clockwork, controlled by an invisible conductor keeping perfect time. Breakfast appeared promptly at 7 o'clock each morning, served on delicate china that made Evelyn nervous just touching it. Lunch followed at 12:30, and dinner at exactly 6 in the evening, all announced by the subtle chime of a bell that echoed through the marble halls. Mrs. Chen, the housekeeper, had kindly provided Evelyn with a detailed schedule of the household routines. "Mr. Duval prefers structure," she'd explained gently, noting Evelyn's overwhelmed expression. "You'll get used to it." But getting used to it proved challenging. The mansion staff moved with practiced efficiency, their polite nods and careful smiles making Evelyn feel like an intruder in a well-oiled machine. She tried to help with household tasks, only to be kindly but firmly turned away. "Please, Mrs. Duval," Mrs. Chen would say, "that's what we're here for." Benji, on the other hand, adapted with the resilience of childhood. He'd already charmed the kitchen staff into sneaking him extra cookies and convinced the gardener to teach him about the different flowers in the greenhouse. His laughter, when it rang through the quiet halls, seemed to momentarily brighten the mansion's formal atmosphere. Matthew himself remained an enigma. He attended countless meetings, both at home and at his office, leaving early and returning late. When their paths crossed, he was unfailingly polite, but distant, like a host addressing a guest rather than a husband speaking to his wife. One evening, after tucking Benji into his new bed, which he still declared was like sleeping on a cloud, Evelyn walked the quiet hallway toward her own room. The thick carpet muffled her footsteps as she passed Matthew's study, where light spilled from beneath the heavy wooden door. The board seemed satisfied for now. A man's voice, Matthew's lawyer, she recognized, drifted through the door. But we need to maintain the image carefully until June. I'm aware, Matthew replied, his tone clipped. Just making sure we're clear. The contract marriage expires June 3rd. We don't want any misunderstandings about expectations beyond that date. Evelyn's hand flew to her mouth, stifling a small gasp. She knew, of course she knew, that this was all temporary. The marriage contract had been clear. But hearing it stated so boldly, expires June 3rd, like they were discussing a lease or a business deal. That will be all. Matthew's voice was firm, dismissive. Evelyn hurried away before the door could open, her vision blurring with unshed tears. She made it to her room. Her temporary room, she reminded herself bitterly, before the first tear fell. Sitting on the edge of her bed, she wrapped her arms around herself, trying to hold in the sudden wave of pain. What had she expected? This was exactly what she'd agreed to, a business arrangement. She and Benji were nothing more than convenient props in Matthew's corporate image rehabilitation. Benji, her sweet, trusting boy who'd already started calling this place home, who'd asked just that morning if they could plant a garden in the spring, a spring that would come after their June 3rd expiration date. A fresh sob caught in her throat. She needed to protect him. He'd lost so much already. She couldn't let him grow attached to this temporary fairy tale, only to have it yanked away. A knock at her door made her hastily wipe her eyes. "Come in," she called, proud that her voice remained steady. Matthew opened the door, his tall frame filling the doorway. He'd loosened his tie, and for once looked slightly less than perfectly put together. "I thought you might like to see the gardens tomorrow morning," he said. "The late roses are still blooming in the greenhouse." Evelyn forced her lips into what she hoped was a convincing smile. "That would be nice, thank you." He nodded, hesitated as if he might say something else, then bid her good night and closed the door. In the silence that followed, Evelyn moved to the window, looking out at the moonlit garden below. The roses would bloom and fade, and by June 3rd, she and Benji would be gone. Just another business contract completed. "Lord," she whispered, pressing her forehead against the cool glass, "give me strength to protect my son's heart and—" She hesitated, then added softly, "and mine." She could hear Benji's soft breathing from his connected room, peaceful in his sleep. Tomorrow she would smile and admire Matthew's roses. She would be gracious and grateful for this temporary shelter. But she would remember June 3rd, and she would guard their hearts carefully until then. Moving quietly to check on Benji one last time, she watched his peaceful face in the dim night light. He clutched his favorite stuffed bear, the one thing he'd insisted on bringing from their old apartment, and smiled slightly in his sleep. "We'll be okay," she whispered, smoothing his hair gently. "No matter what happens after June 3rd, we'll be okay." The mansion's clock chimed 10, its measured tones echoing through the halls. Another perfectly timed moment in this temporary life. Evelyn returned to her room, leaving the connecting door slightly ajar, as always, and prepared for bed. As she slipped between the silk sheets, she made herself a quiet promise. She would remember that this was all temporary, that June 3rd loomed ahead like a wall between now and whatever came after. She would be grateful for the help this arrangement provided, but she wouldn't let herself or Benji forget that it was just that, an arrangement. The moon cast long shadows through the floor-to-ceiling windows, and somewhere in the garden, a night bird called. Evelyn closed her eyes, trying to find sleep, while the words "expires June 3rd" echoed in her mind like the mansion's endless chimes. Morning sunlight streamed through the frost-touched windows, painting golden patterns across Evelyn's bedspread. She'd barely slept, the words from last night's overheard conversation still echoing in her mind. but she had promised to tour the gardens with Matthew, and she wouldn't go back on her word. Dressing warmly in a sweater and jeans, still new, still strange to wear such nice things, she made her way downstairs. Matthew waited in the kitchen, 2 steaming travel mugs in his hands. "I thought you might like some coffee for our walk," he said, offering her one. "It's quite cold this morning." "Thank you." She wrapped her hands around the warm mug, grateful for both the heat and the gesture. They walked in comfortable silence through the manicured paths. The garden was beautiful even in late autumn, with ornamental grasses swaying in the breeze and late-blooming chrysanthemums adding splashes of color. "The greenhouse is just ahead," Matthew said, pointing to a gleaming glass structure. "But first, I'd like to show you something else." He led her down a less maintained path where fallen leaves crunched beneath their feet. Through a cluster of old oak trees, Evelyn spotted something that made her heart catch. A wooden swing set, its once bright paint faded and peeling. Matthew stopped, his shoulders tense. "It was Tommy's," he said quietly. "My son's." Evelyn's breath caught at the raw pain in his voice. She'd known he'd lost a family, but hearing him speak of his son made the loss suddenly real. "He loved that swing set," Matthew continued, his voice cracking slightly. "Would spend hours out here. Said he could touch the clouds if he swung high enough." He cleared his throat. "I should have had it removed years ago." "No," Evelyn said softly. Sometimes keeping these things helps us remember the joy, not just the loss." Matthew looked at her then, really looked at her, and something in his eyes made her heart ache. "How do you do that?" he asked. "Do what?" "Find hope in everything, even in old, broken things." She thought carefully before answering. "Maybe because I've learned that broken doesn't always mean worthless. Sometimes the broken places are where the light gets in." They stood in silence for a moment, watching leaves dance around the empty swings. Finally, Matthew gestured toward the greenhouse. "The roses are waiting." The greenhouse was warm and fragrant, filled with late-blooming roses in shades of pink and red. Matthew showed her around, pointing out different varieties. Evelyn noticed how his professional mask slipped just a little, revealing genuine enthusiasm for the flowers his mother had originally planted. That evening, after their garden tour, Evelyn stood in the massive kitchen, chopping vegetables. The staff hovered uncertainly until she gently shooed them away. "Please," she said kindly to Mrs. Harrison, the cook, "let me do this tonight." She worked steadily, the familiar motions of cooking bringing comfort. Into the pot went chunks of beef, carrots, potatoes, and herbs, a simple stew her grandmother had taught her to make. The kitchen filled with the homey scent of comfort food. When Matthew came home from his office, he paused in the kitchen doorway, surprise evident on his face. "You didn't have to cook," he said. "That's what the staff is for." "I wanted to," she replied simply, ladling stew into bowls. Sometimes the simplest things mean the most. They ate together in the formal dining room, Benji chattering about his day with his tutor. Matthew remained quiet, but Evelyn noticed how he finished every bite, even accepting a second helping when she offered. Over the next week, Evelyn began leaving small notes on Matthew's desk, simple scripture verses written in her neat handwriting. "Be strong and courageous one day. Love is patient, love is kind," another. She never signed them, but they both knew who left them. At first, there was no acknowledgement of the notes, but then small changes began to appear. One afternoon, she found Matthew in the driveway with Benji, fixing the wobbly wheel on the boy's bike. The next morning, instead of taking his breakfast in his study, he joined them at the table. But it was 3 days later when the real miracle happened. Benji was telling one of his rambling stories about a squirrel he'd seen doing backflips off a branch. Probably exaggerated, but Evelyn never dampened his enthusiasm. Suddenly, a sound filled the room that made both Evelyn and Benji freeze in surprise. Matthew was laughing. It wasn't just a polite chuckle or a forced response. It was genuine laughter, deep and rich, as if it had been stored away for years and finally found its way free. His eyes crinkled at the corners, and for a moment he looked years younger. The laughter faded quickly, and something like embarrassment crossed his face. But Benji beamed at him, delighted, and continued his story with even more enthusiasm. Later that night, after tucking Benji in, Evelyn sat at her desk and wrote out another verse for tomorrow's note. "A merry heart does good like medicine." She thought about the sound of Matthew's laughter, how it had transformed his whole face, how it had felt like a gift, precious and rare. June 3rd might be coming, but right now, in this moment, something was healing in this house, and maybe that was enough. Looking out her window at the garden below, she could just make out the old swing set in the moonlight. Broken things, she thought, remembering her words to Matthew. Sometimes they just needed time and care, and someone to see the value in them still. She closed her eyes and whispered a prayer of thanks, for laughter, for healing, for the small miracles that came in unexpected moments. Tomorrow would bring what it would bring. But today had brought laughter, and that was something to treasure. The boxes of Christmas decorations sat in neat stacks around the living room, each one carefully labelled in Evelyn's handwriting. Though it was only mid-November, she wanted to bring some early cheer into their lives, especially for Benji. Her son had been fighting a nasty cold all week, and the weather had kept him indoors more than usual. "Are you sure about this, Mom?" Benji asked from his spot on the couch, wrapped in a thick blanket. "It's not even Thanksgiving yet." Evelyn smiled as she opened another box. "Sometimes we need Christmas magic a little early, sweetheart." She pulled out strings of colored lights, letting them pool in her lap like bright rivers. Besides, there's no rule that says joy has to wait for a specific date. Together, they began transforming the formal living room. Evelyn had asked Mrs. Harrison, the housekeeper, for permission first, not wanting to overstep. The older woman had seemed delighted by the idea, even contributing some cinnamon-scented pine cones from her own collection. The afternoon light was fading when Matthew's car pulled into the driveway. Evelyn heard his measured footsteps in the hall, then silence as he reached the living room doorway. She turned, a strand of lights in her hands, to find him staring at the scene before him. Colored lights draped the windows, tinsel sparkled on side tables, and the scent of cinnamon and pine filled the air. His expression was unreadable. "I hope you don't mind," she said softly. "Benji's been under the weather, and I thought—" "It's fine," he said, his voice tight. But he didn't move from the doorway. Benji looked between them, then held out an ornament. "Want to help us with the tree, Dad? Mom says it's more special when everyone helps." The word Dad seemed to hang in the air. Benji had started using it naturally a few weeks ago, and neither adult had corrected him. Now, Matthew's eyes fixed on the shining ornament in the boy's hand. Slowly, like a man approaching something that might break, Matthew stepped into the room. He set down his briefcase and removed his suit jacket, carefully draping it over a chair. Then, rolling up his sleeves with precise movements, he took the ornament from Benji. "Where should this one go?" he asked, his voice slightly rough. "Higher up," Benji directed enthusiastically. "Where the lights make it sparkle." For the next hour, they worked together. Evelyn noticed how Matthew's movements gradually became less stiff, more natural. He even smiled slightly when Benji told an elaborate story about each ornament they hung, creating histories for ones he'd never seen before. Just as they were finishing, The lights flickered and went out. "Must be the storm," Evelyn said, moving toward the windows where rain had begun to fall. In the darkness, the colored lights from their decorations cast soft, shifting patterns across their faces. She felt rather than saw Matthew move to stand beside her. In the gentle glow, his features seemed softer, less guarded. For a moment they stood in comfortable silence, watching the rain and the play of colors. When the power returned, Benji cheered, but something lingered in that quiet moment, something that made Evelyn's heart beat a little faster. Later that evening, after tucking an exhausted Benji into bed, Evelyn headed to the kitchen to make some hot cocoa. To her surprise, she found Matthew already there, staring out the window into the rainy darkness. "Would you like some?" she asked, holding up the cocoa tin. He nodded, and she set about heating milk on the stove. The familiar motions helped ease the unexpected tension she felt. When she handed him a steaming mug, topped with tiny marshmallows, he almost smiled. "I haven't had this since—" He stopped, his fingers tightening around the mug. "Since Sarah and James?" she asked gently. His wife and son's names felt foreign on her tongue. They were rarely spoken in this house. Matthew's jaw clenched, but he nodded. They loved Christmas. Sarah would start planning decorations in July. He took a shaky breath. James was just 6 when... Evelyn waited, letting him find his words. "It was my fault," he finally said, so quietly she almost missed it. "I was supposed to pick them up that night, but I had a meeting. Another endless, meaningless meeting. Sarah drove instead, in the rain." His voice cracked. "If I had just been there..." Without thinking, Evelyn reached across the counter and placed her hand over his. "Matthew, look at me." Slowly, he raised his eyes to meet hers. "God still has plans, even for broken hearts," she said softly. "What happened was a terrible tragedy, but carrying that guilt won't bring them back. It only stops you from living the life they would want for you." A tear slipped down his cheek, and he didn't brush it away. In the soft kitchen light, he wasn't the powerful CEO or the distant husband of convenience. He was just a man carrying too much pain for too long. "How do you know?" he whispered. "How can you be so sure about God's plans when life can be so cruel?" Evelyn thought about her own losses, about watching her husband die, about all the nights she'd prayed over Benji's sickbed. "Because I've seen beauty grow from ashes," she said. "Because every morning the sun rises again, and every winter ends in spring. Because love is stronger than death, and hope doesn't need proof to be real." Matthew looked at her then, really looked at her, as if seeing her clearly for the first time. Not as the poor waitress he'd married for convenience, or the mother of a sick child, but as someone who understood, who might even help him find his way back to light. They sat together in understanding silence, sipping cocoa as the rain fell outside, the Christmas lights from the living room casting colorful shadows through the doorway. Something had shifted between them, something neither was ready to name, but both could feel. In that moment, contracts and deadlines seemed very far away indeed. The morning headlines hit like a thunderclap. Evelyn saw them first, spread across her tablet screen as she made breakfast. "Billionaire CEO's secret wedding to Waitress sparks controversy." Her hands trembled as she scrolled through article after article, each more sensational than the last. "Mom?" Benji's worried voice made her look up. "Are you okay?" She forced a smile. "Of course, sweetheart. Just reading the news." Matthew strode into the kitchen, his face tight with tension. He'd already seen the stories. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. "I should have prepared you for this." Before she could respond, his phone buzzed. The board wanted an emergency meeting. His ex-fiancée, Sabrina Lowell, had apparently called it herself. "I'll come with you," Evelyn said firmly, though her heart raced. Matthew shook his head. "You don't have to face them." "Yes, I do." She straightened her shoulders. "I'm your wife now, even if it's just on paper. I won't hide." The boardroom felt arctic when they entered. 14 pairs of eyes studied her like scientists examining a specimen. Sabrina Lowell sat at the far end, immaculate in a designer suit, her perfectly manicured nails drumming against the polished table. "Matthew!" Sabrina's voice dripped honey-coated venom. "How kind of you to bring your new bride." Evelyn lifted her chin slightly, remembering her father's words about dignity being inside, not out. "Perhaps," Sabrina continued, "you'd like to explain how this waitress," she spat the word like poison, "managed to secure a marriage to one of America's wealthiest CEOs without anyone knowing." "My wife," Matthew's voice was steel, "doesn't need to explain anything to this board." "Oh, but she does." Sabrina slid a folder across the table. "Especially her rather interesting financial history. 3 missed rent payments this year alone, a repossessed car, medical bills in collections." She smiled coldly. "Tell me, Mrs. Duval, how much did you know about Matthew's worth before you caught his eye?" Evelyn felt heat rise in her cheeks, but kept her voice steady. "Every penny I owe is for my son's medical care. I've never been ashamed of working hard or struggling to save him." She met Sabrina's gaze. "And I knew exactly who Matthew was the night we met. He was a kind man who helped me lift boxes when my wrist was hurt." Something flickered in Matthew's eyes at her words. The tension broke slightly when his phone rang, another reporter wanting a statement. "The charity dinner," he said suddenly. "This Saturday. We'll make our first public appearance there. The press can see for themselves who my wife really is." The next few days passed in a blur of preparation. A stylist arrived with dresses, a coach taught her which fork to use, and security briefed her on protocols. Through it all, Evelyn prayed for strength and grace. Saturday evening arrived clear and cool. Evelyn stood before her mirror in a simple but elegant navy gown, her honey blonde hair swept up. Matthew appeared in the doorway, handsome in his tuxedo, and stopped short. "You look beautiful," he said softly. The drive to the hotel was quiet, broken only by Benji's excited chatter from the back seat. They'd decided to bring him, showing they were a real family. Cameras flashed as they arrived. Evelyn held her head high, Benji's small hand in hers, Matthew's steady presence at her side. They made it through the gauntlet of reporters and into the glittering ballroom. Sabrina materialized almost immediately, champagne in hand. My, they did manage to clean you up nicely." She looked Evelyn up and down. "Though you can't quite hide that discount store shine, can you?" "Thank you," Evelyn replied calmly. "Your words remind me to stay humble." The response caught Sabrina off guard. Throughout dinner she tried repeatedly to embarrass Evelyn, but each time Evelyn's genuine responses and quiet dignity won over those around them. When asked about her background, she spoke honestly about her struggles as a single mother. When questioned about her faith, she shared simply but powerfully about finding strength in hard times. The real moment that changed everything came during dessert. Benji, tired from the long evening, crawled into Matthew's lap and said clearly, "Dad, can we go home soon?" The room fell silent. Cameras clicked rapidly. Matthew's arms tightened protectively around the boy, and something in his face softened. Later that night, as reporters clamored outside the hotel, Matthew took the microphone at the podium. "My wife," he said firmly, "is the most sincere and courageous person I know. She works harder than anyone in this room, not for wealth or status, but for love. I'm proud to call her Mrs. Duval, and anyone who questions her character will answer to me. The ride home was quiet again, but different this time. Benji slept between them in the back seat, his head on Evelyn's lap, feet across Matthew's. "Thank you," Evelyn whispered, her voice shaking slightly, "for defending me." Matthew didn't speak, but in the darkness of the car, his hand found hers. His fingers were warm and strong as they laced through hers, and in that silent gesture, something shifted between them. Something real. Something neither had planned for. The reporters' cameras caught none of it, but there in the quiet car, with their sleeping son between them and their clasped hands hidden in shadow, a truth neither was ready to face began to bloom. The morning sun painted golden stripes across the mansion's marble floors as Evelyn stood in Matthew's home office, nervously twisting her hands. "I was thinking," she began, "about using some of the foundation's resources to help at the children's clinic downtown, the same one that treated Benji last year." Matthew looked up from his laptop, his expression softening. "Of course, whatever you need." "Really?" Her eyes brightened. I know what it's like, sitting in those waiting rooms, counting pennies while your child needs help." "You'll need a foundation credit card," he said, reaching for his wallet. "And James can drive you." "Oh no, I couldn't. Evelyn." His voice was gentle but firm. "You're my wife, at least on paper. Use the resources available to you." The next day, Evelyn walked into the clinic she'd once frequented as a worried mother. Now she carried bags full of new toys, books, and art supplies. The worn-out waiting room transformed as she set up a cheerful reading corner and activity station. "Mrs. Duval?" A nurse approached, recognition dawning. You're Matthew Duval's wife?" "Yes, but please call me Evelyn." She smiled warmly. "I used to bring Benji here. I thought maybe I could help make the wait a little easier for other families." As the week progressed, Evelyn spent her mornings at the clinic, reading to children, comforting worried parents, and quietly arranging to cover bills for the most desperate cases. The staff watched in amazement as the infamous billionaire's new wife sat cross-legged on the floor, playing board games with sick children. Back at the mansion, Matthew was making changes of his own. His assistant stood shocked one afternoon when he cancelled 3 board meetings. "Family commitment," he said simply, picking up his keys to pick Benji up from school. That afternoon, father and son worked on Benji's science project together. Matthew's precise engineer's mind merged with Benji's creative spirit as they built a model solar system. "Dad?" Benji said casually, making Matthew's heart skip. "Can we make cookies after this? Mom always lets me lick the spoon." Later, the kitchen filled with warm vanilla scents as the 3 of them worked together. Flour dusted Evelyn's cheek, and without thinking, Matthew reached out to brush it away. Their eyes met, and something electric passed between them before Benji's giggle broke the moment. "You got flour in your fancy suit, Dad." The days took on a gentle rhythm. Morning walks through the garden became their ritual, Benji running ahead to chase butterflies while Matthew and Evelyn walked close enough for their hands to brush occasionally. He found himself sharing more about his late wife and son while she opened up about her struggles as a young widow. "I used to think being strong meant never needing help," she admitted one morning, watching Benji examine a flower. "Now I'm learning it sometimes means being brave enough to accept it." Matthew's meetings grew shorter, his evening calls fewer. Instead, he'd join them for board games or help Benji with homework. The staff whispered about the changes, how their stern employer now smiled, how laughter echoed through once silent halls. One evening, soft music drifted from the living room stereo. Benji lay on the couch, wrapped in his favorite blanket, watching his parents with sleepy eyes. Matthew stood and held out his hand to Evelyn. "Dance with me?" She hesitated, then placed her hand in his. He drew her close, one hand at her waist, the other holding hers against his chest. They moved slowly, the golden lamp light casting their shadows on the wall. Benji's quiet giggles mixed with the music as Matthew twirled Evelyn gently. "You're good at this," she murmured. "Business functions, lots of practice." His voice was low, intimate, but never with anyone who mattered. The music swelled, and he pulled her closer. Her head rested naturally against his shoulder, fitting there as if it belonged. Matthew's lips brushed her forehead in the gentlest of kisses, and Evelyn's heart stuttered. For one perfect moment, it felt real. All of it, the family, the love, the future stretching out before them. Then reality crashed back like a wave. Later that night, after Benji was asleep, Matthew passed Evelyn's room. The door was slightly ajar, and he heard her voice, soft and broken. "It's all pretend, remember?" She was standing at her dresser, staring at her wedding band. "Don't forget that. Don't let your heart forget that." Matthew stood frozen, pain etching deep lines around his mouth. He wanted to push open the door, to tell her how real it had become for him. How the contract that began this charade meant nothing now. How watching her mother his son and light up his home had changed everything. But the words stayed locked in his throat. He turned away, his footsteps silent on the thick carpet, leaving Evelyn alone with her reflection and her whispered reminders of reality. In his own room, he pulled out the contract from his desk drawer. June 3rd. The date seemed to mock him now. Less than 2 months remained until their agreement ended, and for the first time since signing it, the thought filled him with a cold dread. The next morning, they would go through the motions again, sharing breakfast, exchanging smiles, playing the parts of husband and wife. But now there was an undercurrent of something deeper, something neither dared to name. Every touch held meaning. Every glance asked questions they weren't ready to answer. The mansion that had once felt too big now seemed to shrink around them, filled with the weight of unspoken words and growing feelings that threatened to overflow their careful boundaries. The pretense was becoming harder to maintain, not because it felt false, but because it felt too real. The late afternoon sun slanted through Matthew's study windows, casting long shadows across the polished wooden floor. Evelyn moved quietly through the room, searching behind, leather-bound books and beneath stacks of papers for Benji's missing coloring book. He'd been upset about losing it, and she hoped to find it before bedtime. "It has to be here somewhere," she muttered, remembering how Benji had sprawled on the floor here yesterday, coloring while Matthew worked at his desk. Her hand brushed against a thick manila folder tucked behind some files, and it slipped, spilling papers across the carpet. Sighing, she knelt to gather them up. But as she reached for the scattered documents, a familiar name caught her eye. Turner, James A. Her hands began to shake. James, her late husband's name. The date on the paper was from 5 years ago, just before his death. She began reading, her heart pounding harder with each line. Insurance claim denial, advanced stage cancer treatment, Duval Insurance Corporation, denial of experimental treatment coverage. The words blurred as tears filled her eyes. She remembered those desperate days, James growing weaker, the doctors saying there was still hope if they could try the new treatment. But the insurance company had denied their claim, saying it was too experimental. Without coverage, they couldn't afford it. James had died 3 months later. And now she held proof that Matthew's company, his family's company, had been responsible. Footsteps in the hallway made her quickly wipe her eyes. Matthew appeared in the doorway, His tie loosened after a long day of meetings. "Everything all right?" he asked, noticing the papers scattered around her. Evelyn stood slowly, the denial letter clutched in her trembling hand. "Did you know about this?" Matthew stepped closer, squinting at the paper. "About what?" "James Turner, my husband. Your company denied his cancer treatment 5 years ago." Her voice cracked. "He died because we couldn't afford the treatment without insurance coverage." The color drained from Matthew's face as he took the paper, scanning it quickly. "Evelyn, I had no idea. This was before I took control of the company. My father was still running things then." "Stop!" She held up her hand, backing away from him. "Just stop." The room felt too small suddenly, the air too thick. Everything she thought she knew about their relationship shifted, twisted into something darker. "All of this," she gestured between them. "Everything that's happened, it all came from something evil. If your company hadn't denied James's claim, he'd still be alive. Benji would have his real father. I wouldn't have been working at that diner the night you came in. Please." Matthew stepped towards her, but she moved back. "Let me explain. Things were different then. The company policies..." "Policies?" Evelyn's voice rose. "We're talking about people's lives, my husband's life. Do you know what it was like, watching him suffer, knowing there was treatment that could help, but we couldn't afford it?" Tears streamed down her face now. "And all this time I've been living in this mansion, accepting your help, thinking God had sent us a miracle. But it wasn't a miracle at all. It was blood money." Matthew reached for her, his own eyes glistening. "Evelyn, please. What I feel for you and Benji, it's real. It has nothing to do with what happened back then." "How can you say that?" She wrapped her arms around herself. "Everything that brought us together came from James's death. Every moment of happiness we've had is built on that foundation." She turned away, unable to bear looking at him. "I need to go. I can't be here." "Wait," Matthew called after her as she hurried from the study. "Where are you going?" But Evelyn was already running up the stairs, her mind made up. She found Benji in his room, playing with his toys. "Sweetheart," she said, forcing her voice to stay steady. "We need to pack some things, okay? We're going to go stay at our old apartment for a while." "But why?" Benji looked up, confused. "What about Dad?" The innocent question nearly broke her. "Please, honey, just help me pack, okay?" They worked quickly, throwing clothes and necessities into bags, while Matthew paced in the hallway, trying to reason with her through the closed door. But Evelyn couldn't listen. Every word from him just twisted the knife deeper. She waited until late that night, when the house had grown quiet and Matthew had finally retired to his room. With Benji sleeping on her shoulder, she carried their bags down the back stairs. The Christmas tree they'd decorated together stood dark and silent in the corner, its ornaments gleaming dully in the moonlight. Tears blurred her vision as she remembered that evening. The laughter, the joy, the feeling of finally belonging somewhere. But it had all been built on a lie. She left her keys and wedding ring on the kitchen counter, unable to bear taking anything more from this house, from this life that had seemed too good to be true. The drive back to their old apartment was silent, except for Benji's soft breathing and the occasional passing car. Dawn was just beginning to lighten the sky when she pulled into the familiar parking lot, everything exactly as they'd left it months ago. As she carried Benji up the creaking stairs to their old apartment, she thought of Matthew waking to find them gone. The Christmas tree dark, the house empty. Her heart ached, but she kept moving forward. Inside the apartment, she laid Benji on their old bed, tucking him in gently. Then she sank to the floor beside him, buried her face in her hands, and finally let herself break down completely. "Oh God," she whispered through her tears. Why did you let me love him?" The morning light crept through the dusty windows, painting shadows on the wall as Evelyn sat in the silence, her world shattered around her, trying to find the strength to face whatever came next. The mansion felt different now, emptier, colder. Matthew wandered its halls like a ghost, his footsteps echoing off marble floors that had once rung with Benji's laughter. The Christmas tree still stood in the corner of the living room, but he couldn't bring himself to plug in the lights. The ornaments Evelyn had carefully hung remained frozen in place, catching dim reflections of winter sunlight. Each morning, his routine felt mechanical. Wake up, shower, dress. But now he found himself staring at his closet, remembering how Evelyn would straighten his tie with gentle hands, her touch lingering just a moment longer than necessary. The breakfast table stretched vast and lonely, the chef's perfectly prepared meals tasting like ash in his mouth. He missed the simple comfort of her homemade pancakes, the way Benji would drowsily stumble to the table with bedhead and a sleepy smile. "Sir." His assistant Sarah approached hesitantly one morning. "The board meeting starts in 30 minutes. Matthew looked up from his untouched coffee. "Cancel it." "But sir, this is the third meeting this week." "Cancel everything," he said quietly. "I'm not going in." The days began to blur together. He spent hours in his study, surrounded by papers he couldn't focus on. His eyes kept drifting to the scattered notes he'd found on his desk after Evelyn left. Simple prayers written in her neat handwriting on pastel, sticky notes. "Lord, give him strength for today's challenges. Please watch over him in the board meeting. Help him find peace in quiet moments." Matthew picked up each note carefully, realizing for the first time that every prayer was for him. Not once had she asked for anything for herself. Even in their arranged marriage, she'd been thinking of his well-being, trying to support him through faith when he had none of his own. Across town, Evelyn tied on her familiar blue apron at the diner, fighting exhaustion. The night shift was harder now. Every time the bell above the door chimed, her heart jumped, remembering that stormy night when Matthew first walked in. But it was never him. "Sugar, you look dead on your feet," Rosa, the cook, said kindly. "Take a break. I'll watch your tables." Evelyn shook her head. "Can't afford breaks anymore. Benji's medication?" She left the sentence unfinished. The truth was, returning to their old life felt impossible now. Every corner of their tiny apartment held memories of James, but also newer ones of Matthew. Benji's drawings of their family still hung on the fridge, stick figures of all three of them holding hands. "Mom," Benji asked one night as she tucked him in, "when are we going home?" The question pierced her heart. "Sweetheart, this is our home. But what about Dad? He must miss us." Evelyn smoothed his hair, fighting back tears. "Try to sleep, okay?" But sleep didn't come easily for any of them. In his mansion, Matthew would wake in the night, reaching across empty sheets. The silence pressed in around him, broken only by the tick of the grandfather clock in the hall. He found himself walking to Benji's room, standing in the doorway, staring at the space where the boys' Star Wars nightlight used to glow. Sometimes he'd find himself in the kitchen at 3 a.m, remembering how he'd once caught Evelyn there, dancing as she baked cookies, unaware anyone was watching. The way she'd blushed when she saw him, flour on her cheek, but hadn't stopped smiling. The staff whispered among themselves, worried about their employer's increasing isolation. He barely ate, rarely spoke. His usual precise appearance grew slightly disheveled, his eyes carrying dark shadows that spoke of sleepless nights. Christmas Eve arrived, bringing with it a gentle snowfall that blanketed the city in white. Matthew stood at his office window, watching families hurry past below, arms full of last-minute gifts. The sight of a father carrying a small boy on his shoulders made his chest ache. Without really planning to, he found himself driving to St. Michael's Church that evening. The parking lot was packed for the Christmas Eve service, but he slipped in through the back door, choosing a seat in the last pew where shadows could hide him. The familiar carols washed over him as the congregation sang. He remembered Evelyn humming these same tunes while decorating their tree, teaching Benji the words. The boy's sweet voice had been off-key but full of joy. When it came time for prayer, Matthew bowed his head for the first time in years. Not out of obligation or appearance, but because his heart was finally broken enough to be honest with God. "Lord," he whispered, his voice rough with emotion, "I know I haven't talked to you in a long time. I've done so many things wrong, made so many mistakes. But if I ever deserved any grace at all—" He paused, swallowing hard. "Please, just let her find peace. Let Benji be healthy. They deserve so much better than what I gave them." The candles flickered at the altar, casting warm light across the wooden pews. Around him, families sat together, their hands clasped, their faces peaceful in the glow. Matthew remained alone in his back pew, head bowed long after the prayer ended. In her apartment across town, Evelyn sat on the floor beside Benji's bed, listening to his breathing through the oxygen machine. She'd managed to scrape together enough for a tiny artificial tree, but most of their Christmas decorations were still at the mansion. Still, she'd hung paper snowflakes Benji made at school, trying to make their bare walls festive. "Please, God," she prayed softly, "help me forgive. Help me understand and—" She hesitated, tears slipping down her cheeks. "Please watch over Matthew tonight. Don't let him be alone." The snow continued to fall outside both their windows, covering the city in a blanket of white that muffled all sound. In the mansion, in the apartment, in the back pew of St. Michael's Church, 3 hearts ached with the same quiet longing, for family, for forgiveness, for a chance to make things right. But the night grew deeper, and Christmas Eve slowly ticked toward midnight, leaving each of them alone with their prayers and their pain, waiting for a morning that promised no comfort. The January morning dawned cold and grey as Matthew sat in his office, staring at the resignation letter on his desk. His signature looked strange at the bottom, too final, too permanent. But as he sealed the envelope, a peculiar peace settled over him. The board meeting that afternoon was brief. When accusations of mismanagement flew, Matthew remained silent, his face calm. Sabrina Lowell's smirk of triumph as she gathered her papers told him everything he needed to know about who had orchestrated his downfall. But he felt no anger, only a strange lightness. "You're not even going to defend yourself?" one of the older board members asked, genuine confusion in his voice. Matthew simply shook his head, picked up his briefcase, and walked out. His assistant Janet watched him clean out his office with tears in her eyes. "Sir, this isn't right," she protested. "You built this company." "No, Janet," he said softly, placing a framed photo of his late father in a box. "I just inherited it. But now I think I finally understand what matters more." That evening, he sat in his home office, surrounded by financial statements and charity records. His fingers traced over a pamphlet from St. Mary's Children's Clinic, where Evelyn had volunteered. The memory of her gentle way with the sick children there made his chest ache. Over the next few weeks, mysterious donations began appearing across Willow Creek. First, the diner's leaky roof was suddenly repaired, with no bill sent to the shocked owner. Then the children's clinic received state-of-the-art medical equipment. But most remarkably, dozens of families discovered their medical debts had been paid in full. Matthew worked through careful intermediaries, ensuring his identity remained hidden. He remembered every cause Evelyn had mentioned caring about, every injustice that had brought tears to her eyes. One by one, he addressed them all. At the diner, Evelyn watched the new roof being installed with suspicious eyes. "It has to be him," she whispered to herself, but pushed the hope away before it could take root. The local newspaper ran stories about the mystery benefactor of Willow Creek. Theories flew around town. Was it a wealthy retiree, a secret millionaire, a guilty conscience seeking redemption? Benji read every article carefully, cutting them out and pinning them to his bedroom wall. "Mom," he'd say, "it sounds just like Dad, doesn't it?" "Honey," Evelyn would reply gently. "Remember, he's not really—" But she couldn't finish the sentence, not with Benji looking at her with those hopeful eyes. One particularly cold evening in February, Evelyn took Benji to the church soup kitchen, where she'd started volunteering. The boy's health had improved enough for short outings, and she wanted him to learn about helping others. The kitchen was busy that night, steam rising from huge pots of soup as volunteers hustled about. Evelyn tied on an apron, helping Benji with his, when she heard a familiar laugh from the serving line. Before she could react, Benji had spotted him. "Dad!" he shouted, breaking free from her grasp and running toward Matthew, who stood wearing an apron and serving soup, his expensive watch incongruous against the simple setting. Matthew turned at the sound, his face lighting up with joy before uncertainty crossed it. He knelt down just in time to catch Benji in a fierce hug, holding the boy as if he might disappear. "I knew it was you!" Benji exclaimed. "I knew you were the one helping everyone!" Matthew's eyes met Evelyn's over Benji's head. She stood frozen, one hand gripping her apron, emotions warring on her face. "I've missed you so much," Benji continued, his words muffled against Matthew's shoulder. "Mom misses you too, even though she pretends she doesn't. She still has your business card in her wallet." A blush crept up Evelyn's neck as Matthew's gaze softened at this revelation. The busy kitchen seemed to fade away around them, leaving just the three of them in their own pocket of time. "Benji," Matthew said finally, his voice rough with emotion, "I've missed you too, more than I can say." He glanced at Evelyn again, adding quietly, "Both of you." Other volunteers worked around them, pretending not to notice the scene unfolding. Steam rose from the soup pots, carrying the scent of home-cooked meals. Outside, snow fell softly in the church courtyard, coating the world in pristine white. Benji refused to leave Matthew's side for the rest of the evening, chattering about school and his improved health, while Evelyn worked silently nearby, sneaking glances at them between serving bowls of soup. Matthew looked different, she noticed. Humbler somehow. His expensive suit was gone, replaced by simple slacks and a sweater. The corporate mask he'd always worn had vanished, leaving behind something more real, more vulnerable. As the evening wound down and the last guests left, Benji finally asked the question that had been burning in his mind. "Are you really the one who's been helping everyone, Dad?" Matthew hesitated, looking to Evelyn as if seeking permission to answer. When she gave a slight nod, he sighed. "Yes, Benji, but it was supposed to be a secret." "But why?" the boy pressed. "Why didn't you want anyone to know?" Matthew's answer was soft but clear in the quiet kitchen. "Because true kindness doesn't need recognition. Someone very special taught me that." His eyes met Evelyn's again, and this time she didn't look away. The three of them stood there in the church kitchen, surrounded by empty soup pots and the lingering warmth of service, while outside the snow continued to fall, covering all the broken things with its gentle white blanket. As the last volunteers filed out of the church kitchen, Evelyn busied herself with wiping down counters, trying to steady her, trembling hands. The familiar routine of cleaning gave her something to focus on, besides the way her heart raced every time Matthew moved nearby. Benji had fallen asleep on one of the church pews, exhausted from the evening's excitement. His peaceful breathing echoed softly in the quiet space. Matthew rolled up his sleeves and stepped to the sink filled with dishes, grabbing a sponge without hesitation. The sight of a former CEO doing mundane chores still startled her, even after everything. "You don't have to do that," Evelyn said softly, reaching for the sponge. "I want to," he replied, his voice gentle but firm. "Please, let me help." They worked in silence for a while, the only sounds the quiet splash of dishes and the hum of the old fluorescent lights overhead. Steam rose between them, carrying the lingering scent of soup and fresh bread. Finally, Evelyn couldn't hold back any more. "Why are you really here, Matthew?" Her voice cracked slightly on his name. He dried his hand slowly on a nearby towel, taking time to choose his words. "Not for what you might think," he said carefully. "I didn't come to win you back or to fix what I broke." He gestured to the empty soup kitchen. "I came because this community, your community, showed me what really matters. It healed something in me I thought was dead forever." Evelyn gripped the edge of the sink, her knuckles white. "All those donations, the roof at the diner, the medical bills being paid off. Yes," he admitted, "but not to manipulate you. He paused, running a hand through his hair. "I needed to do something real, something that actually helped people instead of just making profits." She watched him, really looked at him for the first time since that terrible night. His expensive suit was gone, replaced by a simple sweater with rolled-up sleeves. His face seemed softer somehow, the sharp corporate edges worn away by humility. "What about the company?" she asked. "Your father's legacy?" Matthew shook his head. "I resigned as CEO last month. The board can have it. I've spent too many years chasing what my father wanted instead of what matters." The weight of his words hung in the air between them. Evelyn turned back to the dishes, but her vision blurred with unexpected tears. She scrubbed harder at a pot that was already clean, trying to hold herself together. "I miss you," she whispered, so quietly she wasn't sure he'd hear. "Both of us do. But I'm so scared." The tears fell freely now, splashing into the soapy water. "How can I trust again when everything was built on such pain?" Matthew stepped closer, but didn't touch her. "I don't need heirs, Evelyn," he said softly. "I don't need a perfect image or a business empire. I need a family. I need laughter in empty halls and prayers before dinner and someone to tell me when I'm being stubborn." His voice grew rough with emotion. "I need you and Benji, but only if you can forgive me. Only if you want it too." Evelyn's shoulders shook as she tried to contain her sobs. All the pain and hope and fear she'd been holding back crashed over her at once. She felt Matthew's presence behind her, steady and warm, but he didn't move to embrace her. He just waited, letting her process everything in her own time. "I don't know if I can," she managed finally. "I want to, but I understand," he said gently. "You don't have to decide anything tonight." He stepped back, giving her space. "I'll keep showing up here every Wednesday and Sunday to volunteer. If you want to talk, I'll be here. If you don't, that's okay too." He paused. "I'm not going anywhere this time, Evelyn. Not unless you tell me to." She wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, turning to face him. "And if I never can? If I can't get past what happened?" His eyes were sad but steady. "Then I'll still be here, helping where I can. Because that's what you taught me about love. It gives without demanding anything in return." Matthew gathered his coat and moved toward the door, pausing to brush a gentle kiss on Benji's forehead where the boy slept. He looked back at Evelyn one last time, his silhouette framed by the falling snow outside. "Good night, Evelyn," he said softly, then stepped out into the winter evening. Evelyn watched through the frosted window as he walked away, his figure growing smaller in the swirling snow. Her heart felt like it might burst from containing so many contradicting emotions, love and fear, hope and hurt, longing and hesitation. She touched her fingertips to the cold glass, watching until Matthew disappeared completely into the snowy night. Then she turned back to the quiet kitchen, where dirty dishes and memories of shared laughter waited patiently for her decision. The January wind whistled through Willow Creek streets, but inside the church basement, warmth and purpose filled the air. Matthew worked steadily, measuring boards for new shelving units while other volunteers bustled around him. His sleeves were rolled up, sawdust coating his arms, and his face held a contentment that caught Evelyn's attention whenever she passed by with donations. Over the weeks, the transformation wasn't just in the buildings he helped restore. The sharp businessman who once commanded boardrooms now sat cross-legged on the floor with children during Sunday school, reading stories with different voices that made them giggle. He carried groceries for elderly neighbors and fixed loose railings at the community center without being asked. One Tuesday afternoon, Evelyn found him waiting outside Benji's school, leaning against his car. Not the expensive one from before, but a modest sedan that didn't draw attention. "I thought maybe I could take him for ice cream," he asked hesitantly. "If that's okay with you." She nodded, watching as Benji ran to him with a bright, "Dad!" that made Matthew's eyes shine. It became their routine. Tuesday afternoons belonged to them. Sometimes they'd work on homework, together at the diner counter while Evelyn served customers. Other times, they'd tinker with old bikes in Matthew's garage or feed ducks at the park. The children's clinic flourished under Matthew's quiet support. New medical equipment arrived, specialists visited regularly, and somehow the billing department kept losing paperwork for families who couldn't pay. When Evelyn asked him about it, he just smiled and changed the subject. Mrs. Henderson, who'd run the town newspaper for 40 years, cornered Evelyn one morning at the grocery store. "That man of yours," she said, shaking her head. "Never seen anything like it. Started out thinking he was just trying to buy good publicity, but you can't fake what he's doing. Love changed him, plain and simple." Evelyn thought about those words as she watched Matthew that weekend, painting the church nursery while Benji helped by getting more paint on himself than the walls. He'd traded designer suits for worn jeans and faded t-shirts, his hands now calloused from real work instead of just signing papers. The following Wednesday evening, she found herself dialing his number before she could talk herself out of it. "Would you like to come for dinner?" she asked quickly. "Nothing fancy, just pot roast and potatoes." The silence on the other end made her heart skip until his voice came through, warm and surprised. "I'd love to." He arrived exactly on time, a bottle of sparkling cider tucked under his arm, remembering she didn't drink alcohol. The small apartment above the diner felt different with him in it, cozier somehow. Benji bounced between them as they cooked together, Matthew following Evelyn's instructions to peel potatoes while she checked the roast. "This smells amazing," Matthew said, inhaling deeply. "Like..." He paused, searching for words. "Like home?" Benji supplied, helpfully, making them both laugh. Dinner was simple, but filled with easy conversation. Benji regaled them with stories about school, his hands flying as he described the science project Matthew had helped him with. Evelyn found herself relaxing, remembering how natural it felt to have him there. "Remember when you tried to make pancakes that first morning at the mansion?" she teased, passing him more bread. Matthew groaned. The smoke alarm going off at 5 in the morning? How could I forget? The look on Mrs. Parker's face when she found me waving a dish towel at the ceiling. "But you kept trying," Evelyn said softly. "Every morning for a week until you got it right." Their eyes met across the table, understanding passing between them. He had kept trying, with the pancakes, with being a father to Benji, with becoming someone worthy of trust again. Benji's head started nodding halfway through his second helping, his fork slowing until it rested against his plate. Without hesitation, Matthew stood and gathered him up, the boy instinctively curling into his chest. "Down the hall," he whispered, and Evelyn nodded, watching, as he carried Benji to his room with the careful tenderness of a father who'd done this 1,000 times. She cleared the dishes quietly, listening to Matthew's low voice reading a bedtime story. When he returned, he began drying the dishes she'd washed without being asked, falling into their old rhythm. "You've changed," she said finally, passing him a plate. "So much." Matthew shook his head, a gentle smile touching his lips. "No," he replied, his voice certain. "You did that. You and Benji showed me what really matters." He set down the dish towel, turning to face her fully. "You showed me that love isn't about grand gestures or solving problems with money. It's about showing up every day, doing the small things that make life better for others." Evelyn felt tears prick at her eyes, remembering the man who'd walked into her diner that stormy night so many months ago. The difference was stark, like winter melting into spring, hard ground softening to allow new growth. "I was so angry," she admitted. "When I found those insurance papers, it felt like everything good had grown from something terrible. But watching you these past weeks..." She took a deep breath. "You've built something new, something real. Everything I do now, I learned from you," he said quietly. "Your kindness, your faith, the way you love Benji, it changed everything I thought I knew about success and purpose." They stood in comfortable silence, finishing the dishes together as the evening settled around them. Through the window, they could see the first stars appearing in the winter sky, bright and hopeful against the darkness. Matthew dried his hands slowly, as if reluctant to leave. "Thank you," he said, "for dinner, for letting me be part of Benji's life, he gestured vaguely, "for giving me a chance to show you who I can be." "Thank you for proving that people can change," she replied softly. "That love really can heal what's broken." He gathered his coat, pausing at the door. The moment stretched between them, full of unspoken words and tentative hope. Then he smiled, the same gentle smile that had begun appearing more and more often lately, and stepped out into the night. Evelyn stood at the window, watching him walk to his car. The streetlight caught the silver threading through his dark hair, and she remembered how it had appeared gradually over these weeks of honest work and quiet redemption. He looked up, caught her watching, and raised his hand in a small wave before driving away. She touched her fingers to the cool glass, a smile tugging at her lips. The apartment felt warmer somehow, filled with the lingering presence of shared laughter and simple love, the kind that grew slowly, built on trust and time and small moments of grace. Spring arrived in Willow Creek like a gentle awakening. The morning air carried the sweet scent of blooming dogwood trees, and sunlight danced through new leaves, painting everything in shades of hope. Downtown, the old white church, a landmark since the town's founding, had been shrouded in scaffolding for weeks, sparking curious whispers among locals. Evelyn noticed the work happening, but tried not to think too much about it. She focused on her shifts at the diner, on Benji's improving health, and on the quiet way her heart had begun to heal. Matthew still came by regularly, his presence becoming as natural as breathing. They'd fallen into a comfortable routine of shared meals, weekend outings with Benji, and long talks that stretched into the evening hours. One crisp Saturday morning, she arrived at work to find a note taped to the diner's door. "Meet me at the church at 10 o'clock. M." Her hands trembled slightly as she read it. The old church held so many memories. She'd attended services there since childhood, had married Benji's father there, had found comfort in its pews during her darkest days. But she hadn't been inside since the renovation work began. At 9:45, she walked up the familiar street, Benji's hand in hers. He was dressed in his Sunday best, though it wasn't Sunday, and wore a secretive smile that made her wonder if he knew something she didn't. As they rounded the corner, Evelyn stopped short, her free hand flying to her mouth. The church stood transformed. The peeling paint had been replaced by pristine white, the broken steps rebuilt, and the garden beds burst with spring flowers, daffodils, tulips, and her favorite purple irises. The old bell tower gleamed in the morning sun, its copper dome polished to a warm glow. "Do you like it?" Benji asked, practically bouncing with excitement. Before she could answer, the heavy wooden doors swung open. Matthew stood in the doorway, wearing a dark suit that reminded her of the day they'd first met. Yet everything else about him was different. His eyes were warm, his smile genuine, and when he held out his hand to her, she took it without hesitation. Inside, the transformation was even more stunning. Sunlight streamed through restored stained glass windows, casting rainbow patterns across the newly refinished pews. White lilies and pink roses lined the aisle, their fragrance filling the air. But what took her breath away was the sight of the entire town gathered there. Faces she knew from the diner, from the children's clinic, from everyday life in Willow Creek. They smiled at her with knowing looks, and suddenly she understood. Matthew led her to the front of the church, where they'd once stood months ago to sign papers in a courthouse. But this was different. This time, when he knelt before her, it wasn't with a business proposition, but with his heart in his hands. "Evelyn," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "When I first walked into that diner on a stormy night, I thought I was just seeking shelter. Instead, I found home." He took her hands in his, and she could feel them trembling slightly. "You and Benji showed me what really matters. Not contracts or companies, but love and faith and family." Tears blurred her vision as he continued. "I'm asking you now, with no conditions and no time limits. Will you marry me again? Let's start fresh, as real husband and wife, the way we should have from the beginning." The word yes caught in her throat, so she nodded instead, tears falling freely now. Behind them, someone started playing the old church organ, its familiar hymn filling the sanctuary with joy. What followed felt like a dream, exchanging rings, speaking vows that came from their hearts rather than legal documents, promises made before God and their community. But the moment that crystallized everything happened just as they turned to face their friends and family. Benji, unable to contain himself any longer, rushed forward and wrapped his arms around both of them in a tight hug. The congregation broke into applause and cheers as church bells began to ring outside, their clear tones carrying across the town like a song of celebration. As they walked back down the aisle together, sunlight streaming through the windows seemed to bless their path. Outside, spring breeze carried flower petals through the air like confetti, and the bells continued their joyful chorus. Benji looked up at them both, his eyes bright with happiness, and whispered the question he'd been holding in his heart. "Mummy, can I call him Daddy now?" Matthew's smile was radiant as he squeezed his son's hand. "You already do, son." The three of them stood there for a moment, framed in the doorway of the old white church, as the bells of Willow Creek rang out their message of hope. 3 hearts once broken, now made whole again through love, faith, and the miracle of second chances. Around them, the town celebrated, but in that moment they were in a world of their own, A family forged not by contracts or convenience, but by the kind of love that transforms, heals, and makes all things new again. The spring breeze carried the scent of flowers and new beginnings, and the bells continued to ring, their joyful sound echoing across Willow Creek, marking not just the end of one chapter, but the beautiful beginning of another. Thank you for being here. If something in this story stayed with you, I'd love to see you again. Subscribe, and tomorrow I'll bring you another story crafted with heart.